All right, welcome. My name's Keith Edwards, and I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach. And you can find out more of me about keithedwards.com. But I get to be with you today to talk about, in this time of COVID-19 and global pandemics and higher education shifting to virtual and online learning, about how that's going for us, and particularly about how we bridge inclusive pedagogy in the online teaching and learning environment. So I'm here to talk with our guest today, Amer Ahmed. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and your work, and then we'll talk about the situation we're in and how we can be helpful for folks.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Keith. I'm a intercultural diversity consultant, primarily working with higher educational institutions. I worked as an administrator at a number of institutions. Earlier in my career, I was more on the student affairs side in terms of where my positions were based, although I've always worked across institutions. Um, I spent about 7 years at University of Michigan. That's where my longest tenure was, working out of multi-ethnic student affairs. Spent a year at Swarthmore. My last administrative position was in the Institute for Teaching Excellence and Faculty Development at UMass Amherst. And I've been an independent consultant for about a year and a half, full time. And it's been fascinating to continue to engage the landscape of this work. But right now it's just really obvious that a lot of folks are struggling with this transition right now, and it's really important that we have meaningful conversations about how we navigate it.
Mhm. And you have done a lot of work and presentations on campuses around Islamophobia. You're doing a
Mm-hmm.
lot of work on faculty development, on inclusive pedagogy and learning. You've keynoted the White Privilege Conference.
Mm-hmm.
You've produced a rap album, right? Anything more you want to
That
say
was a
about some
long
of this
time ago.
background?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was a hip hop activist before I came into higher ed administration, and then actually integrated that into a lot of my diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and would organize summits on our campuses that would bring educators, artists, activists, and organizers, along with youth, pre-college youth, as well as college students. Leveraging hip hop culture as a tool for bringing all types of walks of life together on college campuses and beyond, but also as a voice of equity, and challenging of inequity as well, and which it underlies, I think, both of our work
Mhm.
in terms of how what we're committed to, and it's been an honor to be part of that community
Mhm.
as well.
Awesome. Well, it's been great getting to know you. I'm happy to be able to be with you for this conversation today. So um, here we are. I don't like to usually date these, but I think it's important these days. Here we are, March 27th, 2020, in the midst of COVID-19 and a global pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been at home with my two kids for 2 weeks now. And how are you? Where are you? And how are you doing in the midst of all of this?
Yeah, well, I live in Western Massachusetts. I have a toddler that uh, I've been saying that I've been homeschooling for the last 2 weeks. A colleague told me today that we're not necessarily professionals at that age level, so we're actually schooling at home, not homeschooling. And I
Okay.
I was like, that's a really interesting framing. That's taking up a lot of my time and energy right now. My spouse is working from home. She works at UMass Amherst, so she's about 2 rooms over, having her constant Zoom meetings, and I'm also learning, tidbits about things that are being navigated at UMass Amherst right now, as well as through other colleagues, and continuing to be a resource for a number of folks in whatever way I can. Because we're in uncharted territory, and everyone's trying to figure out how to navigate these new situations that we all find ourselves in.
Mhm. Yeah, and like you, we both work in higher ed, but we no longer work on campuses. We serve higher ed by going campus to campus and doing work and conversations, but that's not happening anymore.
Mm-hmm.
like you, trying to shift how can I contribute to these campus communities virtually. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and doing that, I'm trying to think about how I can shift to doing that in a way that doesn't just take what I would used to do and make it online, but how can we shift to doing that even better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the ways that we can do this virtually that's maybe better than in person, where we're committed to time, place, and date, where there's limitations. One of the things
Mm-hmm.
I'm noticing is that, when I'm with a group of 60 people and it comes to Q&A, we can maybe do 2 or 3 questions
Right.
time, right? And who asks the questions? People who feel confident, and
Mm-hmm.
external processors, and who have questions and maybe want to show off, and are often people with a lot of privilege in their identities. And
Mm-hmm.
online, I can see 50 questions. Now, I don't speak to all of those, but it gets a lot
Mm-hmm.
more voices in, a lot more opportunities. So
Yes,
as I'm
definitely
thinking
can.
about, yeah, I'm trying to think about how we shift to this, and I think we're going to get many folks who are taking their courses from in person to online, maybe for the first time. Lots of people have been doing
Mm-hmm.
that for a long time, but a lot of people doing that for the first time. And also, I'm hearing from a lot of student affairs educators about how we're going to take some of the things that we did in orientation or residence halls or career centers virtual as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, as you mentioned, you've got someone down the hall leading meetings and helming an institution. We have so many colleagues and folks that we work with. What are you observing from this distance that you have? Because you're not in the crisis management day to day, right? We're a little bit
Yeah.
removed. So I think that's an interesting perspective for people who are in it. What are you observing from a distance about what's going on
Yeah.
in
I
higher ed
mean,
right now?
I've been thinking a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's some baseline stuff in terms of student needs, and in terms of what the they're navigating this transition of their lives, while balancing that with everybody on campus also going through their own transition in terms of as administrators and as faculty. Um, Thinking about tuition. A lot of institutions have been trying to figure out um, what the budgetary hit is of the consequences of moving to online and what kind of refunds students are going to get. Of course, the housing piece has just been gigantic in terms of who is actually allowed to stay on campuses, and and what needs and exceptions are made for those students. I think international students being a pretty significant chunk of them. Not obviously there's others, especially those with significant economic needs or challenges. Food, access to food. How do we make sure people have access to food? Challenges around students' home lives, and what are they going back to, and the completely different situations that students are going to, and how well positioned they are to be able to engage in an online learning environment under their various circumstances. Student workers who were relying on those wages to be able to get through the semester, and who's going to be able to stay on for how long, and how much of their expected benefits, especially for non-work study students. Just so many different kind of unprecedented challenges that I just see colleagues facing all over the place.
Right. I really appreciate that. And you're really speaking to a lot of the pressing issues related to students. And if we're going to provide these resources, what's the implication for staff who now have to be there and can't work from home and provide these services? And we're talking about, deep cleaning of spaces. Somebody's doing that and putting
Mm-hmm.
themselves at risk as they do that. And
Yeah.
there are not unlimited resources, right? If we're going to refund room and board, and we're going to provide this, and we're going to provide food, where's that coming from? And
Mm-hmm.
I saw yesterday in the Chronicle, one person predicted 20% of institutions of higher education will close as a result.
Mm.
And so I think
Yeah.
institutions are trying to do all the right things and trying to continue to exist in the long term,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Which is really pressing.
Yeah, and speaking on a broader level of the staff piece and people who are still at risk by doing their work every day as essential staff, and we see this more broadly in society, in the supermarkets and sanitary workers in terms of trash and recycling and utilities. It's just, it's, I think, it's something that I think as people who do work in equity, we have sensitivity around these things, but I think this has revealed itself more broadly about how the people who are whose work is the most essential for us to be able to do anything, quite honestly, um, are the people who are paid the least, and then under these circumstances have to risk their lives in order to be able to do their work. And so I think there's a lot of learning, and I think that we can connect that to when we talk a little bit about teaching and learning around the need to reflect on what's happening and connect, and that speaks to a broader dynamic of needing to connect experience to our learning. And this is the ultimate case study of
Everything.
of everything. And it doesn't really, I mean, it's completely interdisciplinary. It applies to everybody in every sector on every level. And it's global, it's domestic, it's everything. And the implications are infinite. And so there's so many different ways to look at it. But then the question is, how do we bring in voices to the conversations for us to be able to see and acknowledge all the ways in which people are experiencing this and therefore broader life,
Right.
even beyond this, before what life was like before all this happened.
Right. And I love this framing. It's about the both and, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about everything. This is a science issue, but it's also economic, and it's also about government, and it's also about how our society is structured, and it's also about education, right? As you
Mm-hmm.
started us off, right? Like everything is on the table. It's also about physical well-being, right? We're all trying to navigate, like, how do I do this when I can't leave my home, and can I go outside? And so all of these components are being there. And I love that you're sort of implying that we shouldn't, as we continue teaching, learning about whatever was on the books, rather than set this aside, bring this in, right? And
Yeah.
connect it, because it's so
Yeah.
salient. Everybody's thinking about it. Everybody's tending
Yeah,
to it.
absolutely. And again, I think this is something that I think sometimes in the academy, especially in the classroom, we struggle to do, is that we are human beings having a human experience as we engage in teaching and learning, and this uniquely is something that literally all of us are experiencing at the same time. And it's something that we're all thinking about, and it's all having all these implications in our lives. And many of us can have a shared understanding of what we're all experiencing, but then there's all these elements to it because of how inequitable the world is and has been. There's all these very different ways in which we are experiencing it now under these circumstances that we can be completely unaware of, for the other person in our classroom, for the faculty member, for the staff member, you know, and the opportunity to pull those voices into the classroom and to humanize each other and to learn and understand who we are, what we're going through, what our experiences are, and how and bring a richness to our understanding of whatever content that we're actually going to engage.
So a couple things I'm pulling from this is we shift into talking about, the purpose of this is inclusive pedagogy in online learning, and we really want to get into that. But I'm hearing a few key points here. One is, talk about the shared human experience. Be human, tend to your students' needs, what's going on, and yours. And I think we often get messages that I should do that in the first 10 minutes of class and then get to my subject matter. And what I'm hearing you're suggesting is, don't create this either or, bring the both and. Like, how do you connect the human element? And how can we, those who are faculty, say, I'm not really comfortable in this online environment. This is going to be hard for me. And so give me a little grace.
Yeah.
I've taught this class for 20 years, but I've never done it like this. and what's hard for you, and just be
Mm-hmm.
human and connect with each other. The other
Yeah.
thing about this that is counterintuitive to much about I think we're socialized in higher education is we're socialized to be experts and to know all the things. And what you're saying is you don't know really much of anything, right? We're all in this what my language in Buddhist language is beginner's mind. Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anybody who's lived through a global pandemic.
Neither do
I
I.
don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
Um, and so, how can
And,
we be in this space of unknowing and questions and navigating it together? And we talk about good educators helping be good company on the journey. Well, how do we be
mm-hmm.
good company to each other on this journey?
Yeah. And it requires humility,
Yes.
which is which is a cultural value and a way of engaging on knowledge, which I think is inherent in the idea of learning. Well, I'm learning something because I didn't know it, right?
Mhm.
Um, and um, and I think that for me, it's an integral component of thinking about inclusive teaching and learning. And I think one of the challenges in Western academic environments is how much we are centered in knowing, um, and or the performance of knowing.
Oh,
And the thing, and if you think about it, especially for faculty, there's not a lot of incentives for not knowing. And all the incentives are around knowing or the performance of knowing, and then therefore there's also an expectation that that's the way we're supposed to conduct ourselves with students as the experts who know everything. And now we're in the situation where a lot of us have no idea what we're doing. A lot of us have never, like you said, online, worked from home, navigated family at the same time as all these things. And so, and we also have varying levels to which literally this virus is affecting our lives, or other health issues that are connected to this because of the overrunning of the healthcare system. And so there's also stress, there's bandwidth issues. And so we also need grace with ourselves, that it's okay for us to feel a little bit overwhelmed. And then how do we reach out to one another? How do we take advantage? I mean, that's literally what we did with each other, was, reaching out to one another and saying, hey, like, how are you navigating this? What's going on with you and, your family in relationship to your career? And so how do we take advantage of the fact that fortunately we do have these methods of communication and technology that weren't present really even a decade ago in the way that they are now. So how do we take advantage of what we do have access to, even though we also know that for our students and plenty of others, access to these tools is inequitable. So, but that's why those of us who do have access to these resources, we have to take advantage of it. We have to utilize it.
yeah. And so I'm sort of tracking on some of the lessons. So far, I've got humility
Mm-hmm.
and humanity,
Mm-hmm.
um, unknowing, the both and the
Mm-hmm.
interdisciplinarity of this. And
Mm-hmm.
then the other one you're implying and what you're just saying is about letting go of the perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not going to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
If you're aiming for perfection in your equity, like you're going to just be stuck and going nowhere. How
Yeah.
can you do the best you can moving forward, manage this with the best lens you can, learn, do better the next time, do better the
Mm-hmm.
next time, miss over here and learn and do better the next time. And I
Yeah,
think
and
as you're
therefore
mentioning,
we can't have an expectation of perfection for our students either. Then, as a
right?
result of that, because I
Yeah.
mean, this is a real challenging transition for them. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, I couldn't help myself, but there's not a lot of incentive for not knowing. There's a lot of incentive for knowing and a lot of incentive for performative knowing. That's I think why faculty meetings are so hard to be in. It's the performative of knowing. I
Well,
think that's
I
my
also think
perspective.
our students have been internalizing that, and
Yeah.
they feel the need, they have to perform knowing, which ends up translating into how we engage in the classroom, even how we engage in other aspects of campus life, in the kind of these woke times, of like what I call the culture of campus social justice elitism, it's just like this pressure to act like you know everything around everything, and therefore there's no room to not know about something, including around social justice and equity issues. Um, and so we have to be able to see how these things connect, right? Like the fact that the expectation of perfection of myself, the expectation of perfection of our students, the lack of humility in the culture of the academy, all of these things have consequences, right? And now we're all thrown into a situation in which we can't be attached to that. And to whatever degree we are, our lack of control in this situation will remind us at every step of the way how that we're not in control and it's impossible for us to be perfect and know everything. And so
Right.
therefore we have to adapt.
Right. Yeah. And many of us are learning to let go of control.
Mm-hmm.
And where do we have agency?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I have decisions? Where do I have influence? Where can I put that? Well, this is powerful. We should maybe define our terms a little bit
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
be good faculty members. So here we are. We're talking about how we can move inclusive pedagogy and online learning environments. So tell us a little bit about what you mean by inclusive pedagogy. We've already talked about so many aspects of it, but
Yeah.
how would you describe or define inclusive pedagogy?
Well, one of the things that I learned when I went to UMass and I joined the Institute for Teaching Excellence and Faculty Development. I mean, I kind of knew this, but you know, most faculty have not been taught how to teach. Most are researchers and content experts. And by default, what people tend to do is that they tend to teach the way they were taught. And a lot of times that's been lecture style, that's been like this being the content expert, downloading information, right?
Mhm.
And so to me, inclusive pedagogy is about drawing from who our students are as resources for learning in the classroom, and to bring who they are and their backgrounds and to create an accessible and equitable experience in which there there's a sense of room and permission to bring all of who they are forward or what they feel comfortable bringing forward, into the space as a resource for learning. And I think this is the ultimate example of that opportunity, is that all the experiences, their backgrounds, the ways in which all of that is so rich for an opportunity to learn. And one of the things I tell faculty all the time is that we should never be teaching, we should never be saying to our colleagues, oh, I'm teaching this same class again, like I did last semester or last year. No, we never teach the same class twice because we have different people in the classroom. And so the question is, to what degree are we engaging the human beings, these human beings are in this classroom, um, as a resource for learning, so that they can feel safe and comfortable in a way that in which they can feel safe and comfortable to bring who they are forward. And that really starts with how we create community, right? How we create an environment in which there's a shared ownership and stake over how we engage each other in the classroom in a respectful and inclusive manner, in which they feel like they have some stake in that. And if in this unique, term in which most people did in-person courses started in person and are now transitioning online. If you didn't do that at the beginning of the semester, I highly recommend the idea of finding ways to call students in, and check in about how are you doing, what's going on, what do you need, what is it that you need to be able to engage in this course going forward? How can I support you? How can I be a resource of support so that you can fully engage this course going forward? And so it means taking a little bit of a pause from the content and really thinking like, hey, like, what do who are we? And we have to remind ourselves in this unique circumstance that this may be the only community that some of our students have right now. And so I don't know if the framing a classroom as a community has ever been more important than right now, of us thinking of ourselves as part of a community of learners, and not just, and that includes the faculty member, that we're all teachers and learners in this space, and that in this circumstance, none of us fully know what we're doing here. So let's engage who each other as human beings in all of the beauty and the imperfections and that we bring to the table. And let's check in with each other. Let's see how we're doing, and let's connect who we are and what we're experiencing to whatever degree we can connect it back to the content of the course. Let's do that. And I know that there's certain faculty in certain disciplines who are like, maybe they have a certification associated with their course or something. They're like, but I can't. The thing is that, like, if we don't do that, there's so many students we're going to lose, especially right now in this process, who they got so many stresses going on that we're not going to be able to bring. You might be able to give the lecture through Zoom, or you might record it and send it out to. I mean, recording is not a bad idea, because some of our students are going to need asynchronous experiences. Based on their circumstances, they might not be able to show up at the time that you're having the class. So we just got to think about that. How do we make an accessible learning environment in which people can bring who they are as resources for learning?
Right. You're making so many connections for me. I think one of the things I'm hearing is you're talking about Freire's notion of the banking model of education being broken. This notion
Mm-hmm.
that as the faculty, we have all the information and we just need to deliver it to you. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
pretty easy to do virtually, right?
Mm-hmm.
Record it, download it, do it. But that's a broken model of education that reinforces the dominant narrative and reinforces oppression. And you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, how do we treat the students as having a wealth of life experience and knowledge and connection and being a part of that? And then also, you were talking about how do we make this part of the content. That reminds me of Bell Hook's Engage Pedagogy, building a lot of Hook's building a lot on Freire. But we don't need a hypothetical problem. We have
Right.
one.
It's the ultimate, yeah.
We have one. This is problem-based learning. This is community engaged learning right here. I'd be hard pressed to find faculty who teach a course that you couldn't connect to what is happening right now in our world in some way. And so build it
Absolutely.
in, make it real.
Absolutely. And we know that that's when students get more engaged, right? Is that when they can connect it to their experience and what's happening in their lives, it's more salient, it's more relevant to them, and they want to engage it because it activates something, and it feels empowering, relatively. And you talked about this, what do we have control over? That's what we have control over, is our ability to be able to reflect and connect our experience to ideas,
Right. Well, and I love this notion of control, because I think to many faculty who have focused on delivering content, it's comfortable because they're in control. And if there are no questions, there's no pushback, there's no challenge, uh, that having that control can make me feel comfortable. And so engaging the learners can be challenging, it can be even a little scary, but I also think it can also be way more fun for the faculty, way more
Absolutely.
engaging for the faculty, way more interesting for the faculty, and in many ways easier. Like, get out
Mm-hmm.
of your own way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's more interesting. It's when the thing is that, like, what I've tried to help faculty understand is that when students are making connections between their experience and the content, and you're creating the opportunity for them to share that, right, as a resource for learning. It's a resource for learning for you too. That's what makes for you the course different than it was last time too, because you're going to learn something, you're going to make a connection that you otherwise wouldn't make a connection to. And you know what, that might impact your research down the line. Maybe you're going to have develop a research line that you never would have considered before, because an experience got shared with you that made you realize, hey, there's a different way to look at this thing that I've done research on already, right? Um, and
Well,
so,
now what you're talking about is teaching as scholarship, not teaching
yes.
informed by scholarship, but teaching as scholarship, thinking and
Mhm.
learning with students, and forming that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So much more engaging. Well, I think we talk about inclusive pedagogy. I know not everybody's on board with that, but probably
Mhm.
anybody who's going to click this link and take the time to watch this is on board with that. We find that valuable. It's in line with our values. It's in line with our personal and professional commitments. But we don't
Mhm.
always know how to do that. And we've talked
Mhm.
about some broad things. Any more tangible, pragmatic, tactical tools that you could suggest or recommend in this virtual world?
Yeah, well, again, when I made that transition to academic affairs from student affairs, I was shocked how many faculty don't create norms and agreements around how we're going to engage in the classroom. That was like student affairs 101 and facilitation of co-curricular learning spaces. And, you know, when I'm when I made that transition, I'm like, well, how do you create community and how do you create a sense of a safe environment for all the different kinds of learners? And I know that some folks think that it can be rote, but for me, when I ask the students, what I ask them, what are the agreements that you need to be able to fully participate and engage as your authentic self, where you feel like you can feel comfortable bringing who you are forward. And and what I do is that I type up what they share, and then I make it a Google document. And for those who are new to Google Docs, it's kind of like a wiki kind of experience, like Wikipedia, in which you have anybody in the class can access to it and potentially edit it. And ideally they'll talk to you about it if they want to edit. And so yeah, I let them know, hey, this is a working document. My job is not for you to be accountable to me, but my job is for you to be accountable to yourself about how
And to
you
each
are going
other.
to engage with one another in this course, in a respectful way that respects all the different trajectories of human beings that have come into this space together, to create a respectful and inclusive community of learners. And I'm going to make this document available to you so that we can revisit it if, first of all, if I'm not meeting my responsibility of enforcing what you all came up with, but then also if there's some things that are not working for you. And one thing that could really change what your agreements are is moving from an in-person to an online environment, and so there might need, if you did create those with students, you might want to revisit them and say, hey, does this still work for you under these circumstances? And so so
Yeah. I mean,
that's
I want
just,
to echo
yeah.
that because, we might have agreed that before people chime in, they're going to raise their hand. Well, I don't know. Maybe you can't raise your hand, right? Depending on
Mm-hmm.
the technology you're using to do this virtually. One of the things I've started saying in my virtual environments is I'm not allowing apologies for kids or pets in the background. We're not even going to apologize. We're just not going to do it. Like,
I
that's just
love that
normal.
one.
We're all working from home. If there's a dog that walks through, don't apologize. Don't explain. Like, it's just
Yeah.
life, right?
Yeah.
And if the kid strolls through, hopefully they're dressed, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we, and this is silly and it makes us laugh, but it also is saying, hey, I see that this is not the ideal circumstances, and I
Mm-hmm.
see you're human and you're dealing with other things besides this, and that's okay, and we're human,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is a
Oh,
way that we can
so
be good to
great.
each other, right?
Yeah.
And so what are the other ways we can just say it's okay, right? and
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things I find hard is that when I'm with a class, particularly longer classes like a 3-hour grad class or a night class, I can tell when they need a break, right? They
Mm-hmm.
squirm, they
Yeah.
move around,
You're right.
they check their phones more. All right, we're going to do a break. And sometimes virtually, it's hard to tell, when do we need a break? Do we need to take a time out here?
Mm-hmm.
Because people have the same needs and they have different needs. Like, they got to get up and move around. They got to do different
Mm-hmm.
things. So,
Yeah.
what a lot of what we're talking about is just how do we be good to each
Mm-hmm.
other, right? And how do we as teachers be good to the students? How do we be good to ourselves? I
Mm-hmm.
think for many of us, this is kind of the upside of what's going on
Mm-hmm.
right now. Is there's so much
Yeah.
awfulness, there's so much pain, there's so much to be frustrated and angry about, which is
Yeah.
very real
Mm-hmm.
and a part of my experience for sure. And people are being so good to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody, but a lot of people are being so good to each other, and I'm seeing so much more compassion and empathy and kindness. And I think some of
Oh
us have
yeah.
a pretty easy time doing that for others, but have a hard time doing that for ourselves. Would you
Hmm.
speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, we have to be, you know, we have to be able to recognize our own limitations in this time, right? That we have only have so much bandwidth. And I think one of the things that I want to bring awareness to, because I know that lots of faculty these days have been concerned about, am I committing a microaggression and am I perpetuating something as they've become more aware of these things, as students have increasingly become more bold in articulating the ways in which they experience inequity, um, is that, when we're tired and when we're stressed, we're much more likely to draw from our automated responses, which means we're going to draw from our implicit biases, and we're going to be more likely to commit microaggressions. And so that self-care is so critical, and it's something that I don't think we do very well in the academy, and we don't talk about it well with and I understand that there's some systemic pressures as faculty are doing 4-4-4-5 loads in many places, and research expectations are higher than others. Administrators are scrambling, especially right now. And again, people are balancing their family lives too. Many people, again, are going back to unsafe or challenging situations. So, it starts with, to whatever degree we can engage in some wellness and taking care of ourselves, um, that translates in our ability to be resources for students. Because, I know that, even for faculty who maybe in the past didn't check in with students as much, what you said is very true about this time, is that people are incredibly concerned about their students and what's going on with it. Are they okay? How do I make myself available? And then I think there's also a question of how do we make ourselves available in a way that's still healthy for ourselves. And so I think faculty also need to think about letting students know what times you're available, still holding office hours, like virtually if necessary, being available during those hours and not being available during other hours. Because I think one thing that a lot of people are starting to learn when you work at home is that it can be very easy to let your work life take over your entire life and be like, oh, well, it's just a 15-minute conversation with the student here and over there and there. But then it ends up kind of, you got to set some parameters, right, around
Mhm.
when are the times you're going to be available as a resource for people, and what are the times in which you need to say, I want to be here for you, I want to support you, and I need to make sure I have time for myself and for my
Right.
family.
I think that's so important. I was just earlier today coaching a senior academic executive, and this person has been under the stress and in crisis management mode, and talking about how are you going to care for yourself. And this person admitted, I'm not very good at that.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to tend to ourselves so that we can be there for other people. And I think selfish gets a bad reputation.
Mm-hmm.
But we know this intellectually, right? And I think we
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of messages about go, 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 always be there for others. But then you're not very good and you're being there for others. You and I fly a lot. We used to. And you get on the plane and they say, in case of cabin pressure, mask will come down. And what do they say next?
Mm-hmm.
Put it
Yeah,
on yourself.
put it on yourself first before you help someone else.
And I think that's what you're encouraging people to do now. How are you going to make sure you get sleep you need, that you get the exercise that you need, that you make time for prayer or meditation that you need, that you make time to zone out and read a bad book or a crappy TV show
Mm-hmm.
so you can show up tomorrow as your best self. And
Mm-hmm.
coming in on, bragging about how much sleep you didn't get is just not a great idea. Now, some of us are not
Yeah.
sleeping well anyway, even though we're
Yeah.
trying. That's a different thing. But how do we take care of ourselves so we can show up for people? And we're circling back to our own humanity. We're circling back to our humility. And I want to, you mentioned this wokeness. but there's a perfectionism in wokeness, right? And
Oh
there's
yeah.
performative
Yeah, the
wokeness,
purity test.
right? And how do we let go of that? And instead of trying to prove to people how woke I am, how can I role model for people how I'm waking up? Right? What are
Mm-hmm.
the things I don't know? What are the things I don't get that I'm trying to learn, and I'm doing that? And I think waking up is a much better and an ongoing process, whereas woke is sort of like a, hey, I'm finished. And we're oftentimes talking about how woke I am in this one particular realm, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't even want to talk about
Around
these
the
other
thing that
realms.
I care about, right?
Right,
Yeah.
where I don't even want to talk about ability because I am clueless there. Or we can talk about gender and
Mm-hmm.
religion, or gender and race, but I don't want to talk about religion because I'm very uncomfortable in that realm, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
might be woke here, but waking up there. And how do we model for students, right? Because that's what we want them to do. We don't want them to show up
Mm-hmm.
finished. We want them to show up and be open.
Mm-hmm.
How do we model
Yeah,
being on that path?
and this is that unique opportunity
Yeah.
to really, if that's not something you've been comfortable with before, this is a real opportunity to really try that out, because you don't know exactly, you might not know exactly what you're doing right now. None of us do, and that's okay. And use this as an opportunity to learn how to do that. And I think, while you were sharing the when we were talking about the self-care piece also, I think we're all collectively starting to realize, like, because we're using our time differently. We're spending time with around in a different space and around different people than we normally were before. And that includes sometimes our own family members. And I think all of this is starting to reveal, like, the insanity of the pace in which so many of us were going at. And I think what I do hope that so many of us reflect on are, what is it that I really value? What are the things that are really important to me? And I'm in terms of teaching and learning, I know our faculty care about our students. They do. They do. And I think that we've been operating in a system that doesn't allow permission for them to actually, for it to be incentivized to care about the needs of our and the circumstances of our students. In fact, there's so many academic environments, there's so many departmental cultures in which the moment you talk about students, they're like, well, what are you doing talking about students? Like, we're here for knowledge construction, and we're not here for the students.
And for the grants and for the
Yeah,
tenure and for the
yeah,
book and the articles that
for the
students
machine
will
of it.
never read. Yeah.
Hmm. And
And
so it's
maybe few people will ever read.
so to whatever degree we're learning and reflecting on what we believe really matters, that we might be realizing in this time. I want us to think about that as related to our students and the classroom, as well. That I know that there are faculty out there who've cared about students, but felt like, I can't put that much energy into that because that's not what's going to get me tenure.
Right.
That's not what's going to get me full professor. That's not what's going to get me the research grant. And so hopefully all of us can have some new takeaways, and find new ways to apply that, in our kind of recalibration of our priorities, whatever that might be.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and you're reminding me that sort of the macro takeaway for me is we need to be less me centered and more student centered, less
Mm-hmm.
instructor centered and more student centered, less faculty centered, more student centered. And I think that's a tangible takeaway if we think about inclusive pedagogy. How do we be less centered on the teacher and more learner centered?
Yeah. I
Right.
mean, student-centered approach to teaching is by definition more, gets you on the pathway to a more inclusive learning environment.
Yeah. And what I want to share is it's so easy to be caught up in, am I doing this right? And am I in the, and do they think I'm smart? And am I going to get a good teaching eval? If you can let
Right.
go of that, which I know it's hard, and harder for others than, But if you can really be focused on the students and their experience and not just say I'm student centered, but really be student centered, put them at the center of your planning, your connection,
Yes,
the humility and the letting go of perfectionism and the bringing all this in, and the humanity just kind of comes along. And so I think
absolutely.
that's sort of a macro shift that can bring in a lot of these other things that we've mentioned
Yeah, it creates a more generative environment in which the learning becomes emergent.
today.
And I think that goes back to course design. And I know that that might not apply to this particular semester, but as we think about the fall and the fact that there still is a very serious possibility that many of us are going to be teaching online this fall. And I don't want to be, I want to be hopeful. I want to be optimistic, but, you know, look, a lot of folks right now are preparing for a very different fall.
That's right.
And so I really, regardless of whether you're going to prepare about for that thinking online or not, thinking about at the course design level, backwards designing our courses around what is it that I want students to learn first before I'm thinking about the content, right?
Mhm.
What am I enabling them to learn, right? What am I opening up for them to be able to learn? And write out those learning outcomes that you're wanting them to learn, and then think about, okay, what are we going to do over the course of the semester? What content can I provide to supplement that learning, right?
Mhm.
As opposed to thinking about, well, I want them to read this and I want to make sure they read this and this and this and this, um, and then I'm going to lecture on it all semester. And that becomes, at that point, it's kind of already a little bit too late. So to whatever degree you're, shifting your teaching practices, the course design is what unlocks the potential of of how inclusive of a class that you can create for your students.
Right. Well, one of the things that I'm noticing is that some of us are thinking about this transactionally, and some of us are thinking about this transformationally.
Mm-hmm.
And this is clearly going to be something that isn't a blip or a bump in the road. This is
No,
going to radically transform everything:
everything. Yeah.
government, healthcare, education, higher education, um, working from home. It's
Yeah.
gonna realign everything. And how do we think about um, not how we're going to take what we did in class to move it online, but how could we do it better online? And that's
Mm-hmm.
where the backward design. If we start with what do I want students to learn, how might online be even better than what we were
Mm-hmm.
doing before? How are there more tools? How could this be more inclusive? How could it be a better learning experience for students? And I think a lot of people are going to find that they don't want to go back to in class because they
Mm-hmm.
found ways to do the learning better in this environment. And
Mm-hmm.
how are we currently, I'm just stunned. There's all these rules in society that no longer apply because we're in a global pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they shouldn't have applied all along. Like, if
Mm-hmm.
we're not turning off people's utilities because they can't afford it in a global pandemic,
I've been
maybe
thinking
we
about
shouldn't
the
go
same
back to
thing.
that. Maybe we
Yeah.
shouldn't go back to that. Like, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of shoulds and rules that we put on ourselves as faculty. But boy, if there's a rule you wanted to break, that was a pretty good time to give it a shot if you think it could improve the experience for students, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
rules that are shifting and changing. We
Yeah.
got to move to concluding here, but any
Mm-hmm.
final words of wisdom or encouragement for folks who joined us?
Well, I mean, what you just said right now, life is not going to be the same
Right.
again. It's just, as a Muslim, there's an experience of in the United States of pre 9/11, post 9/11, two totally different lives. I mean, I
Yep.
can split my life in half between what my life was like before versus after. And there's going to be the pre-corona and the post-corona life for all of us. And then there's this period that it's stretched out more. The current time is stretched out more. Um, but our lives are not going to be the same. And I just really encourage us to be reflecting on what matters, right? I mean, there's so much being revealed to us about what may actually not matter and what may actually matter to us, and how do we translate that into what it means to be an educator, and what moves us and what motivates us to be educators. And so I'm really hopeful that the removing of some of the assumptions and kind of and the sense of new possibilities potentially being out there, and that we can co-create it together, and we can reach out to one another, and we can learn, and, and we can start respecting our colleagues that have been teaching online for a while and learn from them.
Rather than rolling our eyes at them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
So let's model this. I think it's a brilliant point and a wonderful place for us to end. What are some things that matter less to you now than they did 3 weeks ago? And what are some things that matter more to you now than they did 3 weeks ago?
Traveling to a campus to do my work matters to me less now. I'm so thankful for this time with family, and I know I'm super blessed, and I have, I have a home, and I have, access to food, um, and although I have been very intentional about really having gratitude for frontline staff and lots of different kinds of areas of work in the world. I don't know if I've ever had this level of gratitude for people who work at supermarkets, and how integral they are to my ability to access food. And I've been thinking about people who make sure we have clean water, and I'm the kind of person, I generally do think about that, but I don't think my level of appreciation is remotely where it is right now with regard to that, because it's so completely obvious that our ability to live on this planet right now is completely dependent on those people being, and that it's and that there's people literally putting their health and their lives on the line doing that work in order for me and my family to live, and all of us, everybody that I know, to be doing what they're doing right now in this really challenging time. So,
Yeah. Well, I'll join you in that. Earlier this morning, I watched people come and pick up my trash and my composting from the corner, and the world would be a very different place if that didn't happen. And I'm so appreciative. I do appreciate that, like you, but like you, I appreciated it way more this morning.
yeah,
And
I
I'm
mean,
also appreciating my health, which
mhm,
is something that I focus on, but I think I took it for granted. And
mhm.
just tiny little things now feel like, rather than vanity, a necessity.
Yeah. I always did something, had something at the holiday time for the people who took the trash. But like this past week was the first time I literally put a note that said thank you.
Mhm.
I've never done that before,
Yeah,
on a random Tuesday,
got it.
but I just wanted them to know that I appreciate what they're doing, because it allows me to, and my family to be safe and healthy.
Such a great place for us to end, because so many of us are filled with anxiousness and anxiety and fear, and gratitude is the antidote to anxiety. And so
Hmm.
finding things that you can be grateful for, being grateful, expressing that gratitude is a great antidote to a lot of the things that we're trying to manage and stress. Thank you so much for making the time to share some thoughts and insights to help all of us. I want to thank all the folks who took the time to watch this and connect with us. Thank you. We're filled with gratitude, and be well. And I mean that literally.